Hi, I'm Pamela Bailey, and I'm the creator of the Antebellum Diaspora Project. And on today's podcast, I'm talking to author and genealogist Phyllis Biffle Elmore. Phyllis is descended from enslaved ancestors who were forcibly migrated from North and South Carolina to the state of Alabama during the Antebellum era. I found Phyllis on social media where I learned about her work as a family historian and a storyteller. But the author is also working towards preserving landmarks in her ancestral community, including the church and the graveyard that holds much of her family's history in Sumter County, Alabama. Full disclosure, I found Phyllis on social media and later discovered that she and I are related, and we share ancestral family who were forcibly migrated from the Carolinas and relocated to Alabama in the antebellum era.
Hi, Phyllis. I am so thankful that you've taken time to be with me today. Not only are you a U.S. veteran, you are a published author, you are also a family historian as well as a genealogist. Thank you for being with me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Excited to be here.
Awesome, awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about how you got started on this journey and this search to not only find out more information about your family, but to even write about your family.
Oh, I guess I'm going to have to start back when I was a little girl, maybe 4 years old, being taken from Detroit to Alabama to live with my grandparents, dropped off at their doorsteps, and just growing up with these grandparents that I'd never seen before. And my grandmother, both my grandmother and my grandfather were both born storytellers, but especially my grandmother, and the things I had to experience with the elderly people that was in my grandmother's circle, people that she has known most of her life, and growing up with these circle of elders, and listening to their stories, I knew deep down inside a little part of me as a little girl would one day carry these stories, because I really got interested in these storytelling aspect of it years ago, just growing up, going to puberty and just saying, oh, wow, there's some amazing stories. Sometimes I wish I had to listen a little bit harder. I think I missed some things, but I have enough within my toolbox to use to continue the story, to carry the story forward. And I think that's what we're missing in today's society now. For some reason, people stop telling their stories. And I'm here to document that and put it on paper so the world could see who these elderly people who were born just a stone's throw from slavery, what they had to endure. And I captured those stories, and now they're going to be published. My great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, was one of the most interviewed slaves of all of the slave narratives back in the 1930s. And his stories are captured in various books, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 books that's in the Library of Congress. So we were able as a family to get together and read those stories that he told, and he left a pretty strong legacy of who he was, who his parents were, who the slave masters were, and the story about his wife and his wife's family. So all those stories are captured and are documented, and we were able to really get in there and read those stories. And not only that, his daughter is one of his eldest daughter, who was Annie Grace Horn Downson. She lived maybe a mile from the farm where I was raised. She's also in the Library of Congress, and she was what they call a singer. And the Lomax came down in the 1930s and recorded her. So her music, not only is her music in the Library of Congress, but also her field hollers. And these field hollers were what slaves would use to escape, actually. And, the slave masters didn't know what they were doing. And I would listen to my grandparents and the elderly people who would sit in our front yard, and they would talk about these hollers. And, oh, the slave master, he didn't know what we were saying. But to sit on my aunt, what we call her Aunt Tudney, I used to sit on her front porch and listen to her do these hollers and these songs, and it was just such a strong guttural sound. You can just hear it bouncing off the trees and the echoes. And I can just imagine in slavery how they used to do these hollers to warn the slaves who was escaping to be on the lookout. So that was very interesting. And to capture this, like you said, and read about it, things that actually happened. So not only I was able to read about it, but I have firsthand knowledge just from these elders growing up, listening to them, laying hours as I used to lay up under the house and listen to the elders gather in the front yard, because we, as children, we couldn't sit around in front of grown folks and listen.
Mm-hmm.
I had to hide up under the house and just take in all these stories. Sometimes I would just be laughing. Didn't know what they were saying until it was repeated over and over and over again, because for some reason elderly people told the same stories. But I think the most exciting times, the something that I will always remember for the rest of my life is my grandmother. We lived so far out in the country. I mean, it was I'll go into that later, but it was a slave cemetery that was maybe about not even about a quarter of a mile in front of my grandparents' house. So one day I was about 10 or 11, my grandmother took me there because more and more I was getting interested in these stories. And I think I captured this in my book. And we went to this slave cemetery, and she told me, and that it resonated over and over in my mind, even till the day. She said, "You see all these rocks and all these graves laying here, child?" I said, "Yeah, grandmama, I do." And she said, "These are the best stories you ain't never heard." I will always remember that's what she said. In other words, she wanted me to capture those stories, remember them, and never forget. And I turned around to look as I was walking away, and she chastised me. She said, "Don't you ever turn around and look at them." She said, "You always look forward. Don't you just remember what you saw here today." And that I will always remember, because it just sent chills, even as a little girl, up and down my spine. So,
well, even just hearing that is such a powerful thing. It almost is like she spoke into existence what she had in mind for you that you've become today. So before we move forward, I'm going to ask you, if you would, please speak the names of your grandparents and then the great-grandfather that you spoke of.
Okay. Now I have two sides. My great-grandfather, Josh, and my great-grandmother, Alice. And Alice came from the white Macmillans and Tarts of Livingston. And my mother always carried with her, Alice she had no black blood in her. Then I found out, I used to say, well, my mother's just saying that. But then I did, after my research, this is where research comes in, found out that she didn't have any. She was brought over from Portugal as an indentured servant. And her mother, who was a slave, her mother was brought over, I should say. But her mother had a child with the slave master, and that's where my grandmother Alice came into play. So, even though she wasn't really black, but still, in those days, she was black. She was black. They treated her no different than they did the other slaves. And she married my great grandfather Josh Horn, who was interviewed as part of the slave narratives by Ruby Pickens Tart. Now, Ruby Pickens Tart, the person who interviewed her, she was part of that whole clan that went around and interviewed ex-slaves. But she is my she's related to my great grandmother. So, and that's what we call the hush hush. My grandmother, who raised me, she had 3 sisters and brothers who were born in slavery but were sold off while they were still nursing. Now, my grandmother Lula's mother was born around 1840, and all my grandmother would tell me is that her mother Ella told her that her children were sold away from up under them when they were still nursing, still suckling, which I guess and I'm assuming that means that they were still nursing. So Ruby Tart used to really, really like my grandfather. And, even some of my cousins and stuff wondered today, why was that relationship so close between him and Ruby Tart? Because Ruby Tart interviewed him extensively in Alabama. So my great grandfather, Josh, had 16 children with Alice. One of those 16 is his oldest, next to the oldest, my grandfather, Edgar Horn. And my grandfather, Edgar Horn, was married to my grandmother, Lula Horn, who the book is about, because my grandmother, Lula Horn's parents were killed by the ex-slave masters. So my grandmother didn't know who her family was.
Wow.
Sold, and then they were killed, and then her her other sister, Ella, who was born right before her, she was killed by the ex-slave master. So it was just my grandmother who at 13, she was on her own. That was my initial journey, is finding the offsprings or the family, the ancestors of my grandmother, Lula, whose family was separated from her at birth. So
what an incredible story, but it certainly captures what we're trying to do here, with the understanding that we are trying to reunite and find our family members that were separated by slavery. And it's just so emotional, the whole thought. I mean, it's 2021, that's, many years ago, but still incredibly painful to hear.
Oh, yeah.
Because, yeah, and then it was very close still to you and the grandparents who raised you.
Oh, for sure.
They were just like us. They were three-dimensional people who had hearts and minds and their own agency. And regardless of how difficult life was, they loved their families.
And something I learned, a story I learned in all this, because I know oftentimes I've even heard people ask, well, once slavery was over, why didn't they just leave and go up north? Why did a lot of slaves stayed on the plantations that they was enslaved at one time? Until I remember my grandmother telling me that her father and mother after slavery stayed because they always had in their mind that their children would return to that spot. And that's why and then I said, oh my God, that's it. I remember her telling me that.
I'm glad you shared that perspective of families choosing to stay, because my family's been sold off and separated.
Right.
And there's a chance, since this was their home, they may try to make their way back to me.
And they had the sacrifices that they made to stay there. They knew they were going to be mistreated. They knew they wasn't going to be treated fair. But for the sake of reconnecting with their children, they chose to stay rather than to, it have been easily for them to go up north, but they didn't. The sacrifices, I'm just looking at the sacrifice alone to make that choice, the choice that they made to stay rather than to leave. That tells a powerful story, about family, about connections. Yeah, they did. They really, really did. They really did. And you know what? It's so amazing because I have cousins who are, you have the 16 children of Josh. We're a big family. So we have our own little Facebook page and we have our own text messages. And, we constantly call Josh the Uncle Tom, which he was. He actually trained the slave master's dogs to hunt slaves. And so we call him that. And then on the same hand, deep in back of my mind somewhere, he was surviving. He did what he had to do to survive, because because everything, even if you read some of his stories of white people in Livingston, they love Josh Horn because he taught their sons to hunt deer, and he taught them, and it's just, so I wonder, what was the parameters for Josh? What was his thought process in doing what he did? Did he do it because this is my way of survival? Amazing stuff happened during those. It's a lot of interesting stuff. A part of me believes that he was doing what he did to survive because he doted on his white ancestors. His white slave owners. Isaac Horn, who was a slave owner, gave him, at 10 cents an acre or 5 cents an acre, 400. That's how he got the 432 acres, because Ike Horn, the slave master, sold it to him. And I remember, and I recall, and I've even did some research on it and found out to be true, that Ike Horn's son, Isaac Horn Jr., after Ike Horn died, he brought some papers to Josh and told him to sign it because it was about some cattle, some cows. And Josh didn't sign it. And luckily he didn't, because he was trying to get the land back.
But I think it also speaks to the complexities of the human psyche and the human heart.
Yes, for sure.
And one of the terms I talk about recently, and it's generally applied in other areas, but it's called trauma bonding.
Right. Oh.
And it has a lot of that. What you're saying is just trying to survive. Right. Trying to find ways that I can be useful to survive. but also just having the ability to not hate people
Right.
who are keeping you and your children in bondage.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the complexity of that sometimes, very often, we were biological family.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes, for sure.
And so there were so many layers of this. And when we look at that history from, how we live today, it was very different. And every single thing was about staying alive.
Mhm.
We all are sort of working through understanding different things about our ancestors. So I was doing research. I knew that my family had been enslaved in South Carolina, Horry County, on the Oliver Plantation. And I just happened to be reading from those same Federal Writers Project narratives that Josh is recorded in. One's from South Carolina, Josh is in the one from Alabama. And I was looking at a narrative from a gentleman who was Oliver. I had no idea that I had relationships to the Olivers, but he was explaining that his family were DeWitts, which is my family, and that his father had been the slave driver. And so what we know about slave drivers, from what we have gathered, from, reading various materials, is that could have been one of the people on the plantation who could have been the harshest in their treatment of other enslaved people.
Sure, yes.
Again,
Absolutely.
it was something that they had to do. Either it was them or it would be somebody over them who would make their lives more difficult.
Oh, yes, for sure. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So these are some really complicated ideas. And as someone said just recently, we have to be able to think a little bit more abstractly and not think that everything was either purely all good or all bad, as it is with all human beings. But it is really fascinating.
God bless my grandmother, who the book is about. She instilled in me color. She would tell me, she said, I don't care if you're yellow, white, green, purple, or orange. When we cry, we all cry wet. And my grandmother was not the type of person who would harp on color. I mean, I very seldom would she would say anything about being Black, being white. She used to tell me, because she was a quilter, she said, child, she said, the only colors that matter are the ones that I'm putting here in this quilt. And these are the stories I want you to remember. And these are the colors of people, the clothes that are in this quilt of your ancestors and your grandmama's friends who have passed on, who have a story. These are only colors I want you to remember. So my grandmother was an equal opportunity employer. She was, I've never, and I will never meet anyone like her, because she knew how to sew a divide. She knew how, if she was alive today, I'm pretty sure she can sew a rainbow into everything that's going on right now to make things up. She didn't look at no matter what was going on in her life and everything around her, the racism, the Klan, the night riders who would appear at our door. She always had, for instance, I remember one night, the Klan came to our door out in the country. They were looking for somebody. My grandfather was headed to the door and she said, Edgar, go lay back, go get back in the bed, go back in the room. He had his shotgun. My grandmother got up and went to the door, and as a little girl, I got up and I stood around the corner so I can hear everything that was going on. She went to the door and she said, I can't remember how the conversation started, but I heard the white guy say that they was looking for so-and-so boy because he had did so-and-so. And I remember my grandmother told, no, we haven't seen him around here. She said, but y'all boys sure look hungry. Why don't y'all come in here and have some Miss Lula's tea cakes? And they came inside. My grandmother went to the chiffero, opened up the chiffero and gave them her tea cakes with the big pecan in the middle. And they just sit there and they just munch. They said, Miss Lula, you make the best tea cakes in these parts. And they left, they went off. That's why I say my grandmother was a crisis interventionist. She de-escalated the crisis, gave the boy that they was looking for time to get away, And she sent my grandfather back off in the room because the fear of a Black man holding a shotgun. She did those three things, and that's why she was quite a woman. That's probably why she lived to be 105, because she was very spiritual and just, I mean, her heart, she had a heart of gold.
That story is amazing. First of all, it's very reminiscent of the story of the folks coming to get Emmett Till.
Right. Yes.
And it, like I said, it could have gone a totally different way. And so that really is amazing. And just the wisdom of that. But let me just make sure I'm clear on this part of the story. So this crowd, were they hooded or?
Yeah, they were hooded.
So they came into your grandmother's house.
We had
took off their hoods to eat tea cakes.
Eat tea cakes. They came inside our fence. We had a fence. We had a wooden gate. They pulled up to the wooden gate. They a couple of them, few of them got off their horses. I think maybe 3 or 4, because I'm hiding around. So I didn't want my grandmother to see me. And I know 3 or 4 of them came up to the we had a large front porch with a screen door. And by the time they didn't get a chance to knock, my grandmother had opened up the door, because she knew that what would happen if she didn't. So she entered. They could have who knew what they would have done if she hadn't opened the door. But she was busy trying to get my grandfather back in the room, because he wanted to be there. But it was the best thing that could have happened, is for him to go back into the room, because you didn't want to incite, and that de-escalated that by itself. And when she started communicating with them, told them that no, I don't know where that boy is, but he's not here. And then that's when she went into her spiel about them looking real hungry, even though they had their hoods on. But I guess she knew what to say. And she said, and she went to the Schiffer Road, opened it up, got her tea. My grandmother made really good tea cakes, because everybody knew it from 20 miles out, knew my grandmother was a good cook, and she made good desserts. And she really did good with her canning, and she made great tea cakes. Tea cakes was popular in the South. That's a Southern staple, was tea cakes. And they took off their hood and they ate those tea cakes, mumbling, and they went on their way. Yeah, she can intervene in a crisis. And I look back on that day, because when you're young, you just really you kind of take things face value. You don't look deeper inside to see exactly. Right. But I carried this into my adulthood and was able to break it down and look at it, and just look at what the diagram that she built is like. There's more to that. But she de-escalated that crisis. That the guy who they was looking for probably got away because of my grandmother. I can honestly say, I don't think I could have did. I don't think I could have done that. Mm-hmm. Knowing that I was going to be, treated no different than I was in slavery. It really wasn't a big difference. That's a very fine line between how they were treated in slavery and how they were treated post-Reconstruction.
Right. And you say that it's a very fine line. And again, that's one of the things that is a misnomer. People tend to think that, sharecropping was very different because you had an opportunity, to kind of bring yourself up. Mm-hmm. When we know that it was created under a stack system, created for the purpose of people never having the opportunity to actually make money. Right. And so for Josh to be able to even have the money to buy the acreage, that alone is amazing.
Right. And I'm wondering, and a lot of things that I won't find in the book is, how did Josh actually had a chauffeur, he had a car, he had an automobile, he had a chauffeur. So I'm wondering what exactly, that's the stuff you don't read about.
Right.
That you don't read about. And, Josh just learned, just like we talk about colorism, which was a big thing back then. Josh definitely engaged in colorism. He didn't want my grandfather to marry my grandmother because of the color her skin. So he embraced fair-skinnedness, with impunity. He embraced that wholeheartedly, and he, and it was that he did not want to marry a person, his skin color. That's why he searched out Alice and married Alice. And he thought anything was fair was good and anything that was darker wasn't. So, but this is the same type of mentality that the slave master had. You know, that's why you have those field Negroes and you have the house Negroes, the house Negro. I knew I would have been in the field. I had no doubt about it. But you had the house Negroes who was fair skinned. So it's just something, it's a learned behavior.
It is a learned behavior, but it's important for people who are even going to hear this podcast to understand that when you have that mentality, that you cannot love your own.
No.
Because, you know, and again, it makes me think even about the possibility that, you know, maybe Josh was a part of the white family.
Yeah.
And again, enslaved people were taught that if you had white blood, that you were somehow better in stature, smarter than, you know, people who look like you and I look.
Right.
But what's interesting is that we know this history, we know where it comes from. And in many places in our community, it is still perpetuated.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And they don't want to admit that. I mean, colorism is something difficult for African Americans to talk about even today, openly in public. Now, we're sitting in the house around Thanksgiving dinner, everybody in there are, you know, are African Americans. You know, you can talk about it, but to talk about it openly in public, how often you actually hear Black folks talking about the colorism issue. Spike Lee, I'm so glad he came out with the movie School Days, because that kind of like cracked the door to the issue of colorism. And, you know, and it's prevalent, as you said, even today, even in Washington, D.C. When I was dating, it's a large family in Washington, D.C. And it's well known that they marry amongst themselves because they are all fair skinned. Well, I had a date and he was a lawyer, and, you know, after the date, he, you know, talked about how nice time he had. You know, I was a great, intelligent woman, you know, doing well for myself, but he could not bring me home to meet his mother.
Wow.
I was too dark. This is 15 years ago. He could not bring me home, you know, and the only thing that crossed my mind is like, wow, that's really, really deep. You know, that it sounds like something that European would say.
It comes from the same place. There are going to be people who are going to actually see this podcast. They're going to be upset because we're talking about this,
right.
but we need to talk about it for many reasons, because it is prevalent and there are people who are hurt, you know, by this still existing. And the other thing is, I've been blessed to have friends literally from all over the world.
Right.
And I find that people from Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, this same kind of colorism exists. I have a friend who's Italian. She's the only person in her family who was born in this country. And so she would go often back to her country with her family to visit. And she would say that amongst the Italians, that it's the very same thing, that there is this colorism that exists. So even though it's not only an issue for the African American community, I think it's really important that we do understand that it is a stain of slavery. There's a very good chance that, you know, Josh's mother or grandmother would have looked like you or I.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure. Josh was definitely the product of two African members directly from off the boat. You know, he was Josh, if you know, I'm not mistaken, you know, I couldn't give him a DNA test, but I'm absolutely sure both of Josh's parents were African. That's, I mean, we've talked about that exclusive within the Horn clan. Alice was a different story. So, but back to what you said about colorism, because I was a product. I felt that growing up. You know, the issue with colorism. I stand before you, and I recognize that, and I can really look at that as something that was very, very prevalent just in my small environment, you know, because I used to get called little black gal. Come here, old black gal, you know, and it was almost a term of endearment. My grandfather, who I adored, used to come here, black gal. you so black, come here, but it wasn't he said it in jest. It wasn't like he was saying it as an offensive, as being offensive. It was more, like I said, a term of endearment, because I would laugh at it. That was before I really knew what I know today. I was still young, still learning. So, and I wasn't offended by it, because it was normal. That was the norm, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't an issue, but it was not until later on where I went to college. But like you said, there's, I have majority of my friends are people that don't look like me. And we sat around one day and talked about colorism. They didn't know, they had no idea, but colorism and racism, they both are on the same continuum.
They are. They absolutely are. So many people, and I can say this, from, my experience, where I didn't necessarily experience that as a child, because one of the things is that I had a father who was just very intentional about telling my sister and I how beautiful we were, loved our hair, loved everything about us. And it wasn't until I got to college. And I remember, I've written an essay about this, but I can remember going to a university that was an HBCU. I was running for campus queen. And I remember walking past two young ladies who actually looked a lot like me, who were having a conversation, and they were saying it, to the extent that I could hear it. And they were saying, she doesn't even really look like a queen. She doesn't have long hair. She doesn't have light skin. And I remember turning around and going back and saying, listen, I look like your mothers and your grandmothers. And if you can't find a way to love and appreciate who I am, there's no way you can love and appreciate who you are, because I'm a direct reflection of you. And so as much as I love all of my family, and my family is the rainbow, and I've seen your family, they're a rainbow as well, every place on the charts, but I am very grateful that my children who have lighter skin, they have no issues about how they see their cousins who may be a darker hue, or no issue about how they see their mama compared to their daddy. My husband is African American, again, just lighter hue. And I'm just really, really grateful that at least in my family, and that's what you can do. You can work within the spaces of influence that you're in, that perception no longer exists. And because I would never want my children to see pictures of my grandmother and great-grandmother, which I have several pictures, even great-great-grandmother from 1840 that I look so much alike, that they can see her and see the beauty of who she is as an African-American woman.
That's awesome.
How do you think people have the ability to live that closely to those experiences and not be filled with hate and not be angry and still treat people, all people, with a great degree of dignity and respect?
I thought about that over the time, because I look at my grandmother, who has her life at 13 years old was horrendous, where she had to, her older sister, who her mother didn't think she was going to have any children after her children were sold away. My great grandmother Ella, I think it was years before, because my grandmother's sister Ella wasn't born until 1867, 1868. Then my grandmother came along in 1883. And so she was a later life baby. And for Ella's children to be born, to be sold in slavery, and I think when the slave master killed her daughter Ella, I think once my grandmother's daughter Ella was killed by the slave master, I don't think her heart could take it. So she died the next night. She died of a broken heart. So my grandmother had to see that. And she had to see her father, Joe Young. He just disappeared because he was just so hurt. Nobody heard from him since. And Ella, her mother Emma died. Her sister Ella, she was left to keep her sister Ella, Ella didn't die right away but he beat her so bad that she died maybe a month later. So my grandmother was 13 and she had to take care of Ella until she passed. So my grandmother was 13 when she left to go to work for the White Williams family. And still, after seeing all of that, so much love and so, and the only thing I could attach it to is she was so spiritually grounded. That's the only thing I could think of for a person to bury that kind of hate after seeing those things in her lifetime, one thing after another. And I think it was her spirituality that made her the person that she has, that wisdom. And then you're talking about a person, my grandmother didn't know how to read very well, but she knew the Bible. And she believed in God. And it was definitely, if I can't say anything else, so not only is my grandmother, but maybe those people, those other folks we think of who had been treated the same way. Now, in my book, there was two women in there, they're really colorful characters who wasn't didn't have that ability to overcome and forgive like my grandmother did. And it is well known in there, but they were powerful Black women who were part of my sphere, who made me the way I am today, my grandmother. So when they say it takes a community, it takes a village, I totally believe in that concept, because my grandmother, and who you will read about in the book, Miss Sugar and Miss Evelyn and Miss Jubilee, the woman who was a slave, who I used to sit on her front porch, and she would tell me how she put the roots on the slave master. All these women are part of me. All their stories, I've taken a piece, and all their stories, but especially my grandmother looms large over it all, though. So
that's an amazing legacy, though. They were preparing you, for where you are today. And it also, again, speaks to the fact that as a community, we're not a monolith. We think differently, we feel differently, but as you said, it takes all these different personalities. So let's talk a little bit about the book. You mentioned it a little bit, but I do want to share with the audience that as a part of this project that I have right now, that I was able to find information in a website that actually matched DNA. And I found that I was related to someone in your family, Ike Horn, who was a slaveholder of Josh, also came from North Carolina. So a lot of these families actually left the Carolinas and moved to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, taking their families with them. And so when you shared with me about Josh Horn, and I went back and I read his interview in the Library of Congress in the slave narratives, I was shocked to learn that, like my Campbell family, his mother was Ann Campbell. Well, let's talk a little bit about the book, which I'm so excited to hear about. Now, you've got a book that's going to be coming out in 2022. Is that correct?
Right.
Can you tell me just a little bit about it?
It's called Quilter Souls, and it'll be out in December 2022. It's about my grandmother that I've talked briefly about, Lula Horn, and touches on a little bit of her family, but it basically talks about my grandmother, who was a quilter. And she had a very interesting history with quilting, because she only made quilts out of the clothing of people that had passed on. If they hadn't passed on, then she couldn't make the quilt. And so these quilts were almost like considered as talisman, because she felt that if you take new cloth and mix it with old cloth of people who had died on, that's very superstitious, for one thing. And number two, it would disrupt what the quilt is supposed to represent. So the quilt is something that a family member, because for instance, when I used to watch, a person would pass away in the country. My grandfather would go to the funeral, and when he comes back, he would have a big sack of clothing. My grandmother would make the quilt, and the family member would in turn come and pick up that quilt, and my grandmother would wrap it around them. So that represented that this quilt will keep you anytime you're going through hard times or difficulty, you take that and you wrap it around you, and all those spirits of those people, became a living cloth. And because the spirit from those people in that quilt would cover you. So, and that's what my grandmother believed, and that's why I have a Quilter Souls, and with that quilt, and I'm the one who gave it the name Quilter Souls. She didn't. She used to just say the quilts. I mean, she didn't really name it, so I thought it was up to me to name it. So that's why I named it Quilter Souls. And I used to watch them when people used to come and pick up these quilts. It was almost like a ritual. My grandmother would pray over the quilt when once she completed. Then we would wash it in her special potion, and we could never wring the water out of the quilt. We would have to just take it out of the pot and just throw it up on the line and let it dry in the sun. Because if you wring it, that was an omen. You wasn't supposed to wring out a Quilter Souls. You just have to let it dry naturally, and then the person would come and pick it up. So the book is about the stories that are in the quilts. When the people would come, when my grandmother would sit in the front yard making the quilt with me, she would tell me the story, how the person lived and how they died, exactly who this person was, and all the clothing that's going into the quilt. Sometimes she didn't have enough, so I would run out to the smokehouse and get another bag of her scrap quilts of leftovers from other people who had passed on. And she would tell me the story of who these people were. And every person had an amazing story. There's a little more to it, and it's a powerful story in each of those chapters. And by the time the person finished reading the book, they would come to embrace my grandmother and wish that they had known this woman. Because everybody who had ever read this book, would leave with that wow factor. Wow, what a woman, and it goes on to tell you how the people that I grew up with, the women who were instrumental in my life, my grandmother's friends, and those people, those older women, I would sit on the front porch and they would tell me their story. It goes on to tell you about who these people were and how they impacted my life. Even as I became an adult, they were still a part of my life. They were the people that sustained me through some very rough periods in my life. I only had to go back and look. And my grandmother had told me, whenever you hit on hard times, I want you to take your quilt and I want you to remember the stories that I told you. And those stories is what pulled me through some very, very, very terrible times in my life. And that is the book in a nutshell, pretty much.
That is so amazing. And I really appreciate you sharing this with me. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that she has given you, all of these amazing stories, but also probably some of what was given to her that probably comes from Africa, from the belief system. And it's just beautiful. It's just very moving. It's very moving. And I think, again, you maybe even given us a new tradition to think about. Ways that we honor our family that has gone on, and also to know that we can hold on to things that remind us of them, that give us strength in our darkest hours, and that is a beautiful thing.
And you have to, and I tell people whenever I go on public appearances, I tell them that, because I remember a person stood up in one of my presentations and told me that her brother took an old quilt and he used it to fix cars. He lay on the ground to fix cars and oil changes, and and I asked her. I said, I'm a firm believer that every artifact from the past, whether it be a quilt, a brooch, an old tea kettle, it's a story behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't ask somebody, it's best to ask the person while they're still alive, what's the story of that?
Yeah.
Once these people are gone, they are gone. The story goes with them. And so at some point in our lives, we just stop embracing that oral history, and we have to get back to that, especially the kids that are coming up now. You're going to want to know the history of your ancestors. You're really going to want to know that. And the best way to find out is ask that elderly person while they're still alive.
Right now. And I think the other part, as we started off this conversation, If there are any feelings of shame,
Mm-hmm.
I suggest that anybody just go and delve into your family, because you've had to come from people who have some greatness in them to have survived to bring us through. So again, you share so many amazing things. And I will say the quilt is pretty magical because it brought us together.
You never know what blessing is going to come. You don't know where it's going to come from, where that message is going to come from.
Well, I'm going to ask you for just final words. And again, Phyllis, I just want to thank you so very much. I've learned so much. I felt like I knew so much of the story, and today I realized how little I actually did know about it. And I am so glad that you took the time to be with me today. But I'm going to ask you for a final thought. For anyone who is on this journey of discovery, who may have, a few stories here, a few stories there, what would be the best advice that you would give them in terms of starting to go down this journey of discovery, of finding out about the amazing people that they were, who their ancestors were, who they're related to, and what would you share?
I would say document, document, document. Interview, interview, interview. Whoever is alive, if you have elderly people that are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, find the eldest person in that family line and just sit down and just have a talk with them. Because these people they have a wealth of information. I get some people who tell me, say, well, and which I know this does happen because of a lot of our families are still closed mouth because of trauma or things they don't want to reveal or to get out publicly. But if you get an elderly person by themselves, and they will talk. And once they start talking, you just document and just follow along with everything they're saying, because there's something in that story. It's magic in those stories that they have to tell. And then you go to the next eldest person in the family, and just keep talking to, because that's the only way we're going to find out things is by talking to your elders. And that's something that we don't do as much as we used to do. I used to say, I would love to go in a nursing home, all those elderly people in there who never have any family members come and talk to them. Just imagine the kind of information that they have. They would be more than willing to sit down and talk to you, just to have somebody to talk to. Mm-hmm. They have a wellspring of knowledge. But their family members, their children don't want to talk to them. They have nothing, like everything they have is irrelevant. But all those irrelevant information has a serious tone of relevancy somewhere. And I would say, find out the meaning, find out you have old quilt, old brooch, old clock. See, could you get the story behind it? Then you can write a book. I bet you if you start looking at all those pieces, you yourself gonna be able to write a book. Because like my motto is, everybody has a story, but it's up to them to write it. Don't not only write your story, but write your story, RIGHT. Mm-hmm. Everybody have one, but it's up to you to choose to write it, whether or not you're gonna write it or not, because it's something that you need to pass on to your children. And so they can pass it on to their children. So a lot of generations going to follow. And if you don't write it, a lot of generations going to miss out on a wealth of information that could have been, discovered. And now you're having a hard time discovering, just like I do genealogy work. And I have actually had people who did not know who their grandfathers were. Mm-hmm. And their grandfathers thought, that's bad. That's not very good.
You're right. And they've never asked the question, like you were saying. I love the idea of writing the story, RIGHT, because what we know, just from history as we have seen it today, if you don't write the story, then other people are going to write the stories about you, the correct
It might
story.
Not be correct. So write it and write it.
Wow. Well, listen, I just wish you well. I know you've been doing a ton of these interviews. I'm so glad that you've taken the time to be with me. And again, it's just, it's such a blessing to know you and to have you be my family. And I know that the ancestors are rejoicing that we've made.
Yes, they are. They're dancing. I hear them on the top of my roof. And it's not the reindeers either. It was a pleasure being here and hope to come back